are instead transformed in accordance with his likeness through their own action. So I think it should be clear that a theodicy that combines the themes of defeat and soul-making offers some distinct advantages. But of course, it also, the combination of the two faces some important objections. Now, a somewhat playful objection asks why, if it is correct, if this kind of theodicy is correct, an individual would not be justified in seeking to maximize suffering rather than struggling against it, so that its defeat will in the end be more complete and dramatic. Now, efficiency would no doubt require us to concentrate on upgrading only the sufferings of others, since to increase our own might diminish our enthusiasm for the task and so be self-defeating. Okay, but acquiescing, however, in that adjustment, would we not be advancing God's cause by enhancing the sorrow of the world? After all, putting more suffering out there would only multiply opportunities for its defeat, and surely the argument would run, an all-powerful and all-knowing deity would never be at a loss to contrive ways to overcome it. Well, I suppose the response that leads to mind here is that God would doubtless have ample resources to vanquish both the evil and its perpetrators. Okay? And in fact, that answer is in the right vein. We, of course, are not in a position to judge just what quantity and kinds of suffering are most appropriate to securing its defeat. But even if we were, to behave in this way would be to turn against both our nature and our calling. To cause evil is never in itself to advance the enterprise of overcoming it, just the opposite. Evil is contended against by efforts to diminish it, by assisting people through their travails, and by the enrichment of character that accrues from such efforts. Traditional views about the will make it doubtful that the production of evil ever could become, in itself, the object of our conduct. But even if that were possible, to make it our object would be to abandon the work God has set for us, and by so doing, to reject his offer of friendship and to enlist in the cause of the enemy. And now a more serious difficulty has to do with the idea that the hardships of some may be defeated through benefits to others. Now, I emphasized this in discussing the diminishment of suffering because its significance is so sadly unappreciated, even though it is all but impossible to imagine how miserable our state would be were it not for this phenomenon. Yet someone might oppose this idea, arguing that a good God would not permit some individuals simply to be sacrificed to the well-being of others. And hence that the suffering of any one person, the argument would go, must result in some overriding good to that person, in order to be justified. In the language of defeat, this would require that any suffering undergone by an individual become part of a larger state of affairs pertaining to that person's own existence, in which it's defeated. Now, there's some question whether this is a justified demand, and one can argue on either side of it. But I think if you're going to have the as strong a theodicy of suffering as you can, you're going to try to satisfy this particular kind of demand. And so let me just assume that it's justified. Although I think there's a case to be made on the other side as well. Okay. So if this demand is justified, then the opponent of theism appears to be in a very strong position indeed. For he will argue, there is a great deal of suffering in the world for which we are unable to discern any defeating good to the sufferer. There are, to begin with, people whose response to hardship displays not a trace of developing virtue. People who do descend into self-indulgence and bitterness, some indeed who point to their plight, or perhaps that of a loved one, as proof positive that any God there may be is to be pitied if he cannot control the world, or cursed if he can, but in any case not worshipped. For others, the struggle for virtue is at best desultory and intermittent. And we may wonder if any betterment they achieve is worth the pain endured. I think that's the way we feel about ourselves, right? I mean, this is the struggle against evil, it's up and down thing. Now, most troubling of all, perhaps, are those whose suffering appears to outrun any good that might have overcome it, who die with neither warning nor preparation, whose end occurs amid agony that seems to preclude all reflection, or for whom the remorseless decline of old age gradually deprives them of their powers until its ravages become simply a fact to be endured, with no evidence of positive return. Now, surely the antitheist will argue, these are not instances of soul-making, or of any other benefit to the victim that may be held to defeat the evil undergone. And he may continue, if that is the case, we have adequate reason to deny the existence of the God of traditional belief. Now, this is, of course, a version of the so-called inductive or evidential argument from evil, which grants that an omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent God might create a world containing evil provided the evil is justified by a greater good, but maintains that there are many instances of evil for which we find no such good. Now, it is always possible to respond to such arguments by pointing out that they depend on a very dubious assumption, namely that our own capacities and values are sufficiently approximate to God's, that we would in all cases be able to discern such a good were it present. Now it's plain that this is an assumption we have no reason whatever to make. It seems to me, however, that we should not be satisfied with this kind of reply. The Western religious tradition is not one according to which God leaves us in the dark about his purposes for his creatures. And we should hope, at least, that we can formulate a theodicy that can address this issue in a positive way. Yet it may seem that any theodicy must founder on this difficulty, since a theodicy, to be convincing, must be persuasive on the point that there is a compensating good for suffering, one that, in principle at least, we are able to recognize. How is this possible if in many cases we recognize no good whatever? More specifically, how can soul-making constitute such a good if in many cases the sufferer himself turns away from it, if in others its development is halting and stunted, and in still others it has little or no chance even to occur? Now, there are, I think, a few points that may help mitigate the force of this objection. In particular, regarding persons in whom suffering seems to elicit no positive moral response, but rather to provoke only anger and self-pity and so forth. One may question how often this reaction represents the final disposition of the individual in question. Often it is only temporary, and gradually gives way to a more positive attitude and a sincere effort to address the problem at hand. There are many, furthermore, whose words profess rejection of a loving God, but whose actions display considerable patience and courage in their own suffering, as well as compassion toward others in need. It is not at all unreasonable to think the process of soul building is at work in such people, nor to believe that their final stance toward what God actually is will prove to have been better anticipated in their deeds than in their words. Now, obviously, however, these observations do not apply to what presumably comprise the great majority of examples of egregious suffering, cases in which horrible pain or abuse befalls the innocent and helpless, or in which persons of reasonable goodwill are subjected to ordeals whose severity far outweighs any good we see coming from them. Now, does the present theodicy have anything useful to say about these cases? Well, one thing it can say is that they're to be expected. One of the most salient aspects of evil, considered by itself, is its sheer gratuitousness. The fact that it is empty and futile, hostile to all that is worth having, yet still present, still existent in the world. Only when we see it as leading someplace, as indispensable to some positive outcome, are we likely to accept evil at all, and then under protest. Except for that, any amount of suffering in the world, no matter how little, would appear too much. But if this is so, then in a world ordered by its creator to the defeat of evil, there would have to be suffering that appears gratuitous. Were it not so, one of the most troublesome dimensions of evil would be lost, and its defeat could never be complete. What is more, there must be enough in the way of such suffering to present a real challenge, not just to annoy, but to outrage us, not just to call forth redoubled efforts to better things, but to confound and dismay, to taunt and humiliate, to threaten our every hope, worldly or otherwise, with falsity and ruin. Yet this leads to a profound dilemma for theodicy. For if he is committed to the principle that any suffering on the part of a person called to God's friendship will be defeated in some good to that person, the theodicist must insist that no matter how things may appear, no suffering is gratuitous even from the perspective of the individual who suffers, that any and every travail he may face will in the end be caught up in and overwhelmed by some greater good, and that the good in question will count as a good to that individual, that is, as an enhancement to the life and nature of the person himself, one that stands as greater cause for rejoicing than his suffering was for sorrow. Now, to say what such a good might be is a daunting task, to say the least, and it's made more difficult by a certain paradoxical feature, namely that if such a good were ever fully known and appreciated, then for the possessor of that knowledge, the apparent gratuitousness of much evil would cease to be a fact, and this particular dimension of the challenge of suffering might be lost. Yet, if God stands toward the world, is as tradition teaches, and if our standing with respect to him is as I have claimed it to be, then just as the seeming gratuitousness of much suffering is a uniquely offensive dimension of it, so too there is a unique and essential dimension of soul building that is a fitting response to this affront, or there must be, right? And that, for most of us, may be able to occur in no other way. Traditional theology has it that God's action toward his creatures is a manifestation of complete and unconditional love, a love that withholds from us nothing that is for our good, even in the Christian tradition, to the point of handing his own Son over to be sacrificed for our redemption. If, therefore, we are to be formed anew in God's likeness, we should expect to withhold nothing from him. Indeed, the very idea that we have anything to withhold is an illusion, if, as I would argue, we are utterly dependent on him for every moment of our being, every experience we have, and every action we perform. Yet, in the rebellion that is our sinfulness, the rebellion depicted in the story of Adam and Eve, this is precisely the illusion we fall for, setting ourselves up as though we had a claim to ourselves that transcends even the will of God, as though we had the standing before him to set independently the conditions of our destiny. Now, the process of soul-making is... I think I just missed a page. The process of soul-making is... missed a page. All right, the process of soul-making is... it culminates, actually, culminates actually in our giving up any vestige of a claim to ourselves, right? But the idea, I'm missing the crucial page here, but do you have it? Here, let me see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good.